Hello, everyone. It's Professor Buzzkill here, back once again, busting myths and taking names. And one of the biggest things that produces history myths and that enhances history myths and that makes history myths worse is the movies, the movie industry, the film industry. It's something about the human consciousness. If we see it in a film, if we see it in a movie, we believe it. Well, fortunately for you, we're going to talk about one of the most popular movies of the 1980s, one of my favorite movies of all time, and that is Amadeus, about Mozart and Salieri. And it's one of those movies that has created tons of myths. Well, so fortunately, Buzzkillers, for all of you, I'm not going to talk about this any longer. I'm going to only interview Dr. Kristin Franseen from Concordia University, who's an expert in all this and is here to enlighten us about what really happened between Mozart and Salieri. Dr. Franseen, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. This is great. I kind of work more generally on the history of musical gossip, so very, very much hopefully of interest to the Buzzkillers.
Musical gossip is a big thing, and I'm glad you used the word gossip because so much of what we deal with here at the Buzzkill Institute is really urban legends and gossip. It's amazing how these things really do stick in the mind.
Yeah, and one of the things that I find particularly interesting about the myths surrounding Mozart and Salieri is that they really have their origins in gossip that we can trace in different newspapers and fictional stories and things starting in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
So this goes back quite a ways before Peter Schaeffer, who wrote Amadeus, and quite a ways before mass media and instant communication about rumors and that sort of thing. And it's really fascinating just how quickly some of these stories develop and seem to spread across media and languages and all sorts of things.
Well, I think it's safe to assume that all our listeners know who Mozart was. And oh, by the way, I mean, most of our listeners will have seen the movie probably more than once because it's so good. But it's safe to assume that they know who Mozart was, but I don't think they really know, apart from what's presented in the movie, who Salieri was. So maybe we should start with you telling us who he was.
Right. He lived from 1750 to 1825, roughly the period of time we tend to call the classical era in Western art music. So this comes up a lot. He wasn't actually that much older than Mozart. He was about 6 years older. I know, depending on in the movie or if you've seen various versions of the play, he's often depicted as a grumpy old man.
Oh, yeah.
So he was born in northern Italy and moved to Vienna when he was a teenager in the mid-1760s and worked in various capacities for the imperial musical bureaucracy from then onward.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of what he was known for writing at the time and is depicted as writing in the movie as well was opera. Depending on how you define an opera and depending on whether you include things that were written but never performed or were unfinished or parts of pastiches from a bunch of different composers, he wrote somewhere between 38 and 42 operas. Mostly Italian comic opera for Vienna, but some French serious opera for Paris. Of course, Joseph II and Marie Antoinette were siblings.
Yeah.
So there were political connections there. But he also wrote a couple of German comic operas, not entirely along linguistic differences as I think is often depicted between him and Mozart. Of course, Mozart also is best known for his Italian language comic operas.
Right.
These sorts of definitions, linguistic and national identity, are very fluid when you're talking about something like the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Right. So Salieri isn't then this sort of just a functionary. He is actually a serious composer. But listen, Professor, you can't use a phrase like musical bureaucracy.
Yes.
And not expect me to say, what musical bureaucracy? This sounds fascinating. What was the musical bureaucracy in the Austro-Hungarian Empire?
Part of it has to do with the business of being a composer and what your title was and where you worked. So the term Kapellmeister, German, originally meant the person in charge of the music at a chapel, either at a church or at an aristocratic court. And so you had people who were in charge of, for example, the music at St. Stephen's Cathedral.
Right.
Or you had people who were in charge of the chamber music that played at Joseph's court, or people who were involved with the theatrical side of things. And so you had a number of people who held various and increasingly convoluted titles referring to how they were being paid, and they all had their assistants and deputies. And I believe Salieri, once he was appointed Imperial Kapellmeister, sometime in the late 1780s, late 1780s. And that was a position he held. Officially, he didn't retire until his hospitalization towards the end of his life, although he had a number of assistants and deputies and that who would also have been running things as he aged.
Well, that's interesting what you say, first of all, about the age difference not being so great between him and Mozart. But you do get the impression in the movie that Mozart is brought to court as this fresh thing, brand new thing, and everyone, all the older people in the musical bureaucracy, are kind of surprised to see him and interested in the phenom, almost carnival character. But how did Salieri actually meet Mozart? How did that happen?
I'm not sure that we know exactly when they met as people. They were certainly, by the time they were both adults and active in musical circles, they were certainly aware of one another's music. They likely met when Mozart came to Vienna. It wasn't quite this formal, absurd setting that's depicted in the movie.
Okay.
Were probably introduced or made one another's acquaintances around either the court or the opera, just knowing the circles in which they worked. And I think something the movie does that's really effective dramatically, and which many, many Mozart biographers have talked about over the years, is it sort of conflates a number of images of Mozart. When we meet him in Amadeus, he is technically an adult, although played as quite immature, but there's all of this buzz around him as a former child prodigy. And in the 19th century and in a lot of kind of early Mozart biographies, you get all of these ridiculous, cute childhood stories about him and his older sister, Nannerl, touring Europe and playing for royalty and pulling all of these silly pranks and things. And I think a lot of those stories, we hear those stories about Mozart's childhood, but most of the music we listen to by him is from his adulthood and is actually from his time in Vienna during the last decade of his life. And so I think what Amadeus does and what a lot of media about Mozart does is sort of merge amazing child prodigy stories with the adult composer of symphonies and operas and things.
Is there any evidence that he's this goofball, the funny laugh, sort of the high-pitched laugh and all that kind of stuff, and just farting around and stuff? Is there any evidence for that at all?
There's some. The Mozart family, particularly Mozart and his father, did write a lot of letters back and forth, especially as a young man. Mozart was never one to let a dirty joke go to waste.
Right.
In his letters. And there are certainly stories of him upsetting people either by pulling pranks or being particularly sarcastic about a fellow musician. The thing is that there was, during this time in the 18th century, fashion for scatological humor. There are Mozart's mother, in some of her surviving letters to his father, there's some jokes between them and different things. Mozart himself famously wrote a number of quite vulgar letters to one of his cousins. And so there was this sense of humor in the family. Now, a number of people have persuasively argued that nobody who was as successful at getting the operas that he got produced in the 1780s and early 1790s could have functioned in the music business if they were as clueless and childish as Mozart is often depicted in things like Amadeus. You did still then have to be able to network a bit and work with the librettist, the poet who's writing the text of your opera, and get along with the singers and that sort of thing.
In the film, we're presented with this musical bureaucracy. I'm going to use that phrase for the rest of time now, by the way, Professor.
Okay.
Mozart is presented to court as an adult when he finally comes as an adult. And there's this rank of 3 or 4, the Salieri and a couple of other musical bigwigs there. And they're presented as old, fusty establishment types who are not interested in anything new and insist that everything be in Italian because Italian is the language of opera, all that sort of stuff. They seem to be, it's this standard film trope of the innovator fighting against the establishment. Was the establishment that crusty and bureaucratic?
The two characters I think you're referring to are Count Orsini Rosenberg, who was the director of the theater, and Giuseppe Bono, who was Imperial Kapellmeister before Salieri. And what I think that the film is actually depicting in the scenes where they're talking about abduction from the Seraglio and all of the arguments about Mozart wants to write comic opera in German about a harem and everyone is scandalized, is there was a certain level of the theaters being shaken up in Vienna at that time, but it wasn't Mozart doing it. It was the emperor, Joseph II. He was very interested in promoting, as part of his reforms, German language, arts, and literature as more accessible to the people.
Mm-hmm.
And so he established a series of German theatrical companies and things and wanted to promote Singspiel, German language opera. So Mozart and Gottlieb Steffani, who wrote the libretto for the abduction, fit into that with this production. But it probably wasn't Mozart himself just showing up and saying opera should be in German. He had by that point written a couple of operas as a child and as a young man, and would have been very familiar with how theater tended to work.
Okay, well, now let's get on to the juicy part, because the
Yes.
big theme in the film is that Salieri is so upset that Mozart has eclipsed him and is proving to be this supernova of a genius, and he's so jealous and all sorts of motivations that he wants to either Mozart to die or for him to help bring about his death by working him to death with a requiem sponsored and funded by an unknown sponsor and making it all mysterious and basically driving Mozart to his death through overwork and paranoia. What part of that story is true, if any?
Well, it is true that Mozart died in 1791.
Young, and he dies young. He dies young, yeah.
He dies young. He does die while working on a requiem, a mass for the dead. And there was some mystery around who commissioned it, although it was not Salieri. It was this eccentric nobleman who was known for commissioning pieces and then pretending that he had written them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting.
So hence the secrecy. And there actually was a bit of, I want to call it a conspiracy, but a bit of fraud, perhaps, around the completion, because Mozart dies before the requiem is finished. And Constanza, his wife, in order to get the rest of the commission money, has to produce a finished work. So she seeks out a couple of other composers, none of whom are Salieri, by the way. They're all other people that Mozart knew and worked with, to finish the requiem and pass it off as, oh yeah, my husband finished this before he died. Even though she gets one of the composers, Süssmayr, to forge Mozart's signature, and it's dated January 1792. So there are all of these weird things.
Why is January 1792 funny?
Oh, because Mozart died in December 1791. So
Okay.
So it could not, and everyone knew this. It was a polite fiction so that she and the children could get the money. There are all of these weird things surrounding Mozart's death, but none of them really have anything to do with Salieri. But something that crops up later in Salieri's life, you do start to see these rumors that, he had this rivalry with Mozart over opera commissions, or speculation in some musical circles that, Mozart had really struggled because of intrigues by Italian composers at court. Sometimes these stories, as they're reported in various newspapers in the 1820s, sometimes they name Salieri, sometimes they don't. You start to see, as the genre of composer biographies essentially becomes a thing, as people are interested in stories of Mozart's life and stories looking for explanations of why this great musical talent died so young, you start to see some of these rumors take shape.
Oh, so this is not a 20th century invention. This wasn't
Oh,
something that
no.
they came up with just for the play and just for the
No,
film.
no. This is actually something that was in formation during Salieri's lifetime. So at the very,
Wow.
very end of, so he dies in 1825. And bits and pieces of the end of his life, as depicted in the movie, are accurate-ish. He was hospitalized following what is described as a shaving accident when he was in his 70s. And there were stories that he was suffering from what we would consider dementia at the end of his life. Sometimes the rumors that, he confessed to murdering Mozart, sometimes that kind of story gets attached to these reports about his mental and physical health, and sometimes they don't. A friend of his, Giuseppe Carpani, who's a fascinating figure. He was a poet and a friend of Haydn's and a spy at the Congress of Vienna for the secret police.
Yeah.
He actually interviewed a couple of Salieri's nurses and wrote up this report basically saying that there's no proof any of this is true. And I believe that was published in 1824. So not only was this being gossiped about very, very early, but it was also being debunked pretty early on.
Okay. Well, that's fascinating, because here I am blaming the movies and the movie industry for all these problems, yet these are long-standing stories, and the stories and the debunking go back and forth. Does this continue throughout the 19th century, or is it not as important a story in Mozart's life? Does it become one of the standard stories about Mozart's career?
Yeah, it really does become a recurring theme, especially in fiction, about Mozart. In the decade after Salieri's death, so in the 1830s, there are two different German novellas very obviously inspired by the rumors about Mozart and Salieri, both of which have elderly music teacher characters who have potentially dark secrets in their past about their plotting against colleagues or that sort of thing. You also get Alexander Pushkin's short play, Mozart and Salieri, in the 1830s, which depicts Salieri as poisoning Mozart on stage. But in the realm of nonfiction biography, it's interesting because it's a theme that has multiple layers. Most people, even in the more fanciful 19th century composer biographies, there's waxing lyrical about genius cut short. They'll say something like, oh, there's no evidence that Salieri murdered Mozart, but surely they must have been enemies. Or, but surely Salieri must have disliked this one opera or something. And these things will very rarely ever have citations. The grand tradition of 19th century popular historical writing. And sometimes you'll see things that are completely unsourced or that start in fiction, in mostly novels or short stories, that get repeated so many times they start to appear in composer biographies.
Yeah.
In the 20th century, you get a genre of musicological writing called the documentary biography or the life and works, where it's partially a narrative life of whatever composer and then a collection of edited documents related to their lives, and really as a project trying to separate myth from reality, or at least parse which of these letters is real and what's perhaps more spurious. I think what Peter Schaeffer does in both the play and the film Amadeus is he takes these myths that were long established and debates over the myths that were long established, and he reworks them for an audience in the 1970s and 1980s that is really interested in the psychological elements of biography. So in the 1970s, in both biography and in biographical fiction, you get a lot of these stories about the secret life of so-and-so, or revisiting, critically looking at some of the conventions of things like Victorian and Edwardian biographical writing. And I think Amadeus plays with a lot of these notions of these public figures who have secret lives that nobody knows about. If you think about the film, for example, throughout the film, Salieri presents himself and is presumed by Mozart mostly to be Mozart's friend. They sit together in Salieri's salon and argue about the opera, and go to the opera, go to one another's operas, and see each other at social functions. And then the film depicts this secret plot that Salieri is confessing to this priest character, Father Vogler. And so that kind of narrative is, I think, what the 20th century retellings of this story add, is this quasi-psychological dimension.
Well, that's fascinating because in the 70s, especially, theater and films do take a psychological turn. They really do start to concentrate on the psyche as a plot element, frankly. And so it's not surprising that the play and then the film follow that. But I sometimes wonder whether the worst thing about the myths or the retelling of this fable in Amadeus is that we get the impression that Salieri is this second/third-rate composer. In fact, it shows him working on his own compositions, and they're kind of almost childish. It's just the little piano thing that seems very simple and things like that. But in reality, he wasn't second or third rate.
No, he was writing dozens of operas. And one of the things that strikes me in a lot of these fictional depictions of Salieri is how they choose to represent his operas. So the ones they pick are often very serious and very old-fashioned seeming, either musically or dramatically, when in reality, he wrote loads of comedies and parodies of opera. But sort of like the idea of him having a sense of humor doesn't quite fit with the depiction in Amadeus, for sure. And he also, during the 19th century especially, was very well known as a composition teacher. So among his students were Schubert and Beethoven. And so I
didn't know that at all.
Yeah. This idea you get in Amadeus where he's aging and forgotten and nobody remembers him, that part just frankly isn't true at all. His operas do become less popular as tastes change, and he eventually leaves the opera to focus on teaching and to some extent writing religious music. But him himself as a musical figure and as an instructor and a person whose opinions were seen to matter remain important throughout the 1800s and 18 teens.
All right. Well, one final question. Whenever I'm sitting through a film, especially like a Churchill film, I almost jump up out of my seat and start screaming, "That's not true. This is garbage," all kinds of stuff. I want to storm out. But fortunately, Lady Buzzkill has been able to keep a rein on me, and I keep my mouth shut during the actual movie. What's it like for you as a musicologist, as a historian of music, as an expert on all this stuff, to sit through not just Amadeus, but other things that talk about 18th and 19th century music and are full of fables? Do you have these reactions? Do you want to storm and scream and shout?
Sometimes. It's funny. I actually do really like musical biopics.
Yeah.
Even if they're not biographically accurate, which they rarely are. There is sort of a formula to these things.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting how they represent musical events, how they depict different concerts and performances and whatnot. And I also think it's interesting what they choose to include, because sometimes there are little things that they get weirdly right that I'm not expecting amongst all of the "how dare you get that wrong." Thinking about how some of these myths move in unexpected ways. I'm actually going in January. I'm going to Salzburg for the Mozart Week Festival, which is Salieri themed this year.
Yeah.
And they are putting on a new production of the play Amadeus, but they're setting it in the German pop music industry. And I'm very curious.
Oh, interesting.
How some of these stories transfer across musical genres and time periods.
Yeah, that will be absolutely fascinating to see. Well, Dr. Franseen, this has been a wonderful conversation. We encourage people to watch the film Amadeus again. By the way, I think it's a great film. I really enjoyed it and like it. But we encourage them to watch it with fresh eyes. And we hope that you'll be willing to come on the show again and talk about more musical myths and about your own research eventually.
Oh, yeah. I am always willing to talk about historical gossip for sure.
Okay. Two phrases I'm going to use of yours from now on: musical bureaucracy and historical gossip, because they're perfect in so many situations. So it just remains for me to say thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, Thank you for having me.
And Buzzkillers, all the stuff is on the blog post for this episode. We put a link to the movie that you can get on Amazon and in various places. And we put a link to isn't there a good Mozart-Salieri dual biography? I remember this a dozen years ago or so.
There's a really great book by the historian William Stafford called The Mozart Myth. And it goes through a lot of these stories, primarily about analyzing sources in Mozart's life. But it gets into the rumors about his death and things about Salieri and about his wife, Constanza, and a lot of fun.
So again, thanks, Professor.
Thank you.
And we will talk to all of you out there next week.